I drove 4 hours to prep my vacation home for a new tenant, only to find my sister and her husband living there like they owned the place. When I told them to leave, my sister actually laughed in my face. She said Mom and Dad gave us permission, so if you do not like it, you can call the police. She thought she was calling my bluff. She thought I was still the pushover big sister who paid for her mistakes. She was wrong. I did not just call the police. I unleashed a federal investigation that would cost my parents their retirement home and put my brother-in-law behind bars for a decade. Before I tell you how I destroyed my toxic family using forensic accounting, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been treated like a walking ATM by the people who are supposed to love you. My name is Jasmine Sterling, and at 32 years old, I have built a life far away from the chaos of my childhood. I am a forensic accountant here in Atlanta, which means I hunt down money that people try to hide. I am used to dealing with corporate embezzlers and fraudsters, but I never imagined I would have to use my skills on my own flesh and blood. It was a Tuesday evening when I drove up to my investment property in Buckhead. It is a beautiful mid-century modern home that I bought with my first big bonus. It was supposed to be empty and ready for staging. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw a massive Ford Raptor truck parked sideways on my lawn, crushing my hydrangeas. My stomach dropped. I walked up to the front door and tried my key, but it would not turn. They had changed the locks. My hands were shaking as I punched in the emergency code for the garage. As the door lifted, the smell hit me instantly. It was a thick, nauseating mix of skunk weed and stale pizza. I walked into the living room and froze. My pristine white oak floors were covered in mud tracks, and there they were. My younger sister Tisha was sprawled out on my custom Italian leather sofa, painting her toenails a bright neon pink. Her husband Brad, a man who has not held a steady job in 5 years, was sitting in my favorite armchair playing video games on my 85-inch television. He did not even look up when I walked in. Tisha just blew on her wet nails and looked at me with bored eyes. She said, "Hey Jazz, keep it down, would you? The boys are napping upstairs." I felt a heat rise up my neck that I had not felt in years. I asked them what exactly they were doing breaking into my house. Brad finally paused his game and turned around scratching his stomach. He looked me up and down with that arrogant smirk he always wears. He told me to relax. He said they were just crashing here for a few months while his crypto business took off. He spoke as if he was doing me a favor by occupying my property. I took a deep breath and told them they had exactly 5 minutes to pack their bags and get out before I called the authorities. Tisha let out a sharp, cruel laugh. She stood up and walked right up to my face. She said, "You are not going to do anything, Jasmine. Mom and Dad said we could stay here. They said you have 3 houses and you are being selfish. So go ahead. Call the police. I dare you." She smirked, thinking family loyalty would stop me. I pulled out my phone and looked her dead in the eye. I didn't call Mom. I didn't call Dad. I dialed 911 and reported a break-in in progress. I stood on the driveway watching the blue and red lights bounce off the brick facade of my home. I really thought help was finally here. I believed that in America, property rights meant something, and that the law would protect the person whose name was on the deed. I was incredibly naive. When the officer stepped out of his cruiser, I walked toward him with my driver license and proof of ownership ready on my phone screen. I explained calmly but firmly that intruders were inside my home and refusing to leave. But before the officer could even approach the front door, Brad stepped out. The transformation was instant and honestly terrifying. Gone was the arrogant slacker who had just laughed in my face and crushed my hydrangeas. In his place stood a polite, respectful man who knew exactly how to talk to authority figures. He smiled warmly and said, "Good evening, officer. I am so sorry about the confusion. My sister-in-law is just a bit emotional today due to personal issues." I felt my blood boil. I told the officer that he was lying and that he had broken in, but Brad reached into his back pocket and pulled out a piece of notebook paper. It was wrinkled and stained with what looked like coffee, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It was my father Otis's handwriting. Brad handed it to the officer and said, "Her father gave us permission to stay here while our new house is being built down the road. We have been here for 2 weeks getting mail and settling in." The officer read the note and then looked at me with a tired expression. He handed the paper back to Brad and said, "Ma'am, if they have permission from a family member and have established residency, I cannot make them leave tonight. This is a civil matter, not a criminal one. You will have to go through the formal eviction process in court." I stared at him in disbelief. I asked him if he was serious. I told him I am the sole owner of this property. My father has no legal right to grant permission for anyone to live here. It is not his house. The officer just shrugged and said, "I am sorry, but my hands are tied. I cannot determine the validity of a contract or family dispute out here on the sidewalk at night. You need a judge for that. Unless they commit a crime in my presence, there is nothing I can do." He turned around and walked back to his car. As the cruiser pulled away, leaving me in the silence of the night, I looked back at the house. Brad was standing in the doorway, illuminated by the porch light. He was not acting polite anymore. He was smiling. It was a cold, victorious smirk that sent a chill down my spine. He waved at me slowly like a king dismissing a peasant and then slammed the heavy oak door in my face. The sound echoed through the neighborhood like a gunshot. I stood there alone in the dark, realizing for the first time that this was not just a petty family dispute. This was a war. And I had just lost the first battle. The red taillights of the police cruiser faded into the darkness, leaving me standing alone on the sidewalk. The silence of the neighborhood felt heavy like a blanket of judgment. I looked up at my house. The warm pot lights I had carefully selected to highlight the architecture now just illuminated my defeat. But then panic set in. My grandfather's vintage Rolex and the original deed to the property were in the biometric wall safe in the master bedroom. I could not leave them with Brad. I marched back up the driveway, my heels clicking loudly on the concrete. Brad was still lingering in the doorway, watching me with that smug look of satisfaction. I told him I was coming in to retrieve my personal property from the master suite immediately. I stepped toward the threshold, but Brad did not move. He shifted his large frame to block the entire entrance. He is a big man, over 6 feet tall and heavy-set, while I am 5'4". He looked down at me with mock pity. He said, "Sorry, Jasmine, but that is our bedroom now. Tisha and I need our privacy. We cannot have you rifling through our things." I felt a surge of adrenaline. I told him those were my things in my house. I tried to push past him, but it was like trying to move a brick wall. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my silk blazer just hard enough to bruise the skin underneath. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale beer and arrogance. He said, "You are trespassing now. Don't make me use force to defend my home." The audacity was suffocating. He was threatening to hurt me for trying to enter my own property. He shoved me backward with his chest, and I stumbled down the porch steps, nearly twisting my ankle in the mulch. He slammed the heavy oak door, and I heard the deadbolt slide home. Then I heard the distinct click of a second lock. A slide bolt. I realized he must have installed it days ago. I was locked out, physically thrown off my own porch. I stood there shivering in the cool night air, staring at the closed door. My keys were useless. The police were useless. I could hear faint laughter coming from inside. They were celebrating. They thought they had won. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from a cold, calculated rage. I looked at the house one last time. They wanted to play dirty. They wanted to hide behind civil laws and family guilt. Fine. I put the car in gear and drove away. I did not go to a hotel. I went straight to my office downtown. The time for talking was over. It was time to audit their entire existence. I sat in the silence of my car with the engine idling and the air conditioner blasting against my flushed face. My hands were trembling as I pulled up my mother Verna's contact on my phone. I needed to hear her say it was a mistake. I needed to hear her say that my father never signed that note and that they would drive down here immediately to throw Brad out. I pressed the video call button. It rang 4 times before she picked up. She was sitting in her recliner, wearing her favorite floral nightgown and looking completely unbothered. She did not ask if I was okay. She just sighed and said, "Jasmine, I hope you are not calling to cause more drama. I am trying to watch my show." I felt a lump form in my throat. I told her that Brad had just physically shoved me off my own porch and locked me out of the house. I told her they changed the locks and claimed Dad gave them permission. I expected outrage. I expected a mother's protective instinct to kick in. Instead, she rolled her eyes. She actually rolled her eyes at me. She said, "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Jasmine. Brad would never hurt a fly. He is just stressed out because he is trying to get this new business off the ground. You probably provoked him with your superior attitude." I stared at the screen in shock. I asked her, since when does starting a business involve stealing my home? Her face hardened. She leaned into the camera, and her voice dropped to that scolding tone she used when I was a child. She said, "Listen to me. Your sister and her husband are going through a hard time. Brad needs a prestigious address to impress his investors. He cannot run a crypto empire from a rental apartment. You have 3 properties, Jasmine. You live in a penthouse downtown. You do not even use that house. Why are you being so greedy?" The word greedy hit me like a slap. I have paid off their mortgage. I have paid for Tisha's car. I have never asked for a dime. I told her that it is not about the house, it is about respect and the law. I told her that enabling Brad's laziness is not helping him. She cut me off instantly. She said, "We raised you to look out for your family, not to act like some heartless landlord. If you kick them out, you are kicking your own flesh and blood onto the street. Do not let money make you ugly, Jasmine. Do not let a few dollars destroy the love in this family." Then, before I could even respond, she ended the call. The screen went black, reflecting my own stunned expression. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone. The realization washed over me cold and heavy. I was not just fighting my sister and her husband. I was fighting the people who gave birth to me. To them, I was not a daughter. I was just an insurance policy they could cash out whenever their golden child needed a bailout. I wiped a single tear from my cheek and put the car in drive. If they wanted me to be the heartless landlord, I would show them exactly what that looked like. I sat in the plush leather chair of my attorney's office, trying to focus on the eviction paperwork spread across the mahogany desk. The room smelled of old books and expensive cologne, a stark contrast to the chaos I had left behind at my house. My lawyer was explaining the timeline for a standard eviction in Georgia when my phone began to buzz violently against the table. It was not a normal ring. It was a continuous angry vibration that shook the heavy wood. I glanced down and saw a flood of notifications from Instagram and Facebook. I picked it up and felt my stomach drop. Tisha was live. She was sitting on the front steps of my house holding her youngest son on her lap. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she was wiping away tears with a dramatic flair that would have made a soap opera actress jealous. She looked into the camera and sobbed, saying, "I do not know what we are going to do, you guys. My sister Jasmine is kicking us out. She is throwing her own nephews onto the street in the middle of the cold season just because she wants to sell the house for a profit." It was 70 degrees outside in Atlanta, but facts did not matter to her. She was painting a masterpiece of victimhood. I watched in horror as the comments rolled in. Strangers were calling me a monster. They were calling me heartless and greedy. Some were even threatening to find where I worked. She was weaponizing her children and the internet to destroy my reputation before I could even file a legal motion. My lawyer, Mr. Henderson, leaned over and watched the video for a moment. His expression went from professional to grim. He took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He said, "Jasmine, this changes things. Judges are human beings. They see a crying mother and children and they hesitate. If she claims hardship and with this public narrative she is building, they can stall the proceedings. They can request extensions. They can claim they cannot find suitable housing." I asked him how long. He looked me in the eye and gave me the answer I dreaded most. He said if they fight this every step of the way and play the victim card this well, you might be looking at 6 months. 6 months. My heart pounded in my chest. 6 months of them living in my house, destroying my property and dragging my name through the mud. I looked back at the phone screen where Tisha was now asking her followers for donations to help them find a safe place to sleep. She was not just squatting. She was monetizing my misery. I turned off the phone and looked at my lawyer. I told him to file the papers anyway. But deep down, I knew the law was too slow for the war I was fighting. I needed a different strategy. The legal battle was stalling, but the war on the ground was escalating fast. I had barely slept when my phone rang at 2 in the morning. It was not a family member. It was Mrs. Wellington, the president of the Homeowners Association. She was not calling to exchange pleasantries. She was screaming. She demanded to know why my property had turned into a nightclub in the middle of a Tuesday night. I could hear the thumping bass through the phone line. I apologized profusely and drove to the neighborhood, parking a block away to avoid a confrontation. What I saw made my stomach turn. My elegant, quiet sanctuary looked like a frat house during spring break. There were cars parked on the lawn again, tearing up the sod I had just replaced. Red plastic cups littered the driveway. The front door was wide open and music was blasting so loud I could feel it in my chest from across the street. This was not just a party. This was a calculated strike. Brad knew I was the one responsible for the fines. He knew that every rule he broke would come out of my bank account, not his. He was holding a beer, standing on the balcony I had designed, laughing with a group of strangers. He spotted my car down the street. Instead of hiding or shutting the door, he raised his glass in a mock toast and turned the volume up. He was daring me to do something. He wanted me to lose my temper so he could call the police and claim harassment. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I wanted to march up there and pull the plug, but I knew that was exactly what he wanted. I forced myself to drive away, leaving the chaos behind me. The next morning, the email arrived with the subject line, "Notice of violation, immediate action required." I opened it and felt the blood drain from my face. It was not a warning. It was a bill. $5,000. $5,000 for noise violations, improper trash disposal, unauthorized occupants, and operating a commercial venue in a residential zone. The letter stated that if the behavior continued, they would place a lien on the property. My own home was being held hostage. Brad was not just living there for free, he was actively costing me thousands of dollars a week. I looked at the fine, and then I looked at the picture attached to the email. It was a photo of the trash piled up on the curb to prove the violation. But something caught my eye. Among the pizza boxes and beer cans, there were stacks of shredded paper, lots of it. Brad claimed he was a digital crypto genius, but geniuses do not generate that much paper waste. That $5,000 fine was painful, but it gave me an idea. If he was going to break the rules, I was going to stop playing by them. I was done being the victim. It was time to find out what he was really shredding. The glow of my laptop screen was the only light in my penthouse living room as I stared at the bill. $5,000. That was not just a fine. It was a weapon. Brad and Tisha were not just living in my house for free. They were actively destroying my financial standing while I stood outside begging for permission to enter. I felt the familiar burn of tears in my eyes, but this time I did not let them fall. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, inhaling for 4 counts and exhaling for 4. When I opened my eyes again, the sadness was gone. It had been replaced by something much colder and much more useful. Clarity. I realized I had been approaching this all wrong. I had been reacting like a hurt sister trying to appeal to their conscience. But sociopaths do not have a conscience. I had been acting like a landlord trying to enforce a lease that did not exist. I needed to stop thinking like Jasmine the victim and start thinking like Jasmine Sterling, the forensic accountant. I looked at the photos of the trash again, the shredded paper, the expensive car, the sheer arrogance of their lifestyle. Criminals always make mistakes. They always get sloppy when they think they are untouchable. Brad thought he was safe because he had a piece of paper signed by my dad. He thought the walls of my house protected him, but he forgot that he was living inside my asset using my utilities connected to my internet and generating waste on my property. He was not a squatter, he was a suspect. I reached for my phone, but I did not call my lawyer. I opened a new case file on my encrypted server. I named it Operation Eviction. I decided right then that I was done trying to drag them out of the house. That was too easy. If I evicted them now, they would just move on to the next victim. No. I was going to let them stay. I was going to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I would watch them. I would track every penny they spent and every digital footprint they left. I picked up my wine glass and swirled the dark red liquid. A slow smile spread across my face for the first time in days. They wanted a free house. I would give them a cage. By the time I was done with them, they would wish they had slept on a park bench. I was not just going to get my keys back. I was going to build a federal case so airtight that the only door they would be walking through next was a prison cell. I typed the first entry into my log. Day 1 of the investigation. The target is confident. The trap is set. 2 days later, I pulled into the driveway again, but this time I was not looking for a fight. I was looking for a blind spot. I had traded my sharp power suit for a soft, non-threatening cardigan and jeans. In my hands, I carried a peace offering. It was a woven basket filled with expensive organic snacks, imported chocolates, and a brand new high-end gaming headset for Brad. It made me physically sick to my stomach to buy these things for the people who were holding my property hostage, but I reminded myself that this was an investment. As my father used to say before he lost his moral compass, you have to spend money to make money. I rang the doorbell and waited. Tisha opened the door and rolled her eyes, but she stepped aside to let me in. She looked at the basket and smirked with a level of arrogance that made my skin crawl. She said, "I see you finally came to your senses, Jasmine. Mom said you would calm down eventually and realize family comes first." I swallowed my pride and forced a smile that felt like it was cracking my face. I told her I was sorry for overreacting earlier, and that I just wanted to make sure they were comfortable during their transition. I lied through my teeth, and she bought every word of it because her ego needed to believe she had won. Tisha immediately started digging through the basket like a greedy child on Christmas morning. While she was distracted by the truffle oil chips, I told her I needed to use the powder room quickly. I walked into the living room where a large fiddle-leaf fig tree stood in the corner. It was a strategic position that gave me a perfect view of the entire open-concept floor plan, including the living area and the hallway to the bedrooms. I reached into my purse and pulled out a tiny black cube, no bigger than a sugar cube. It was a military-grade surveillance camera with a battery life of 6 months. I nestled it deep into the dark potting soil, hiding it behind a broad green leaf. It was invisible to the naked eye unless you were looking for it. On my way back from the bathroom, I stopped in the kitchen. The kitchen is where people talk. It is where they leave their mail and where they let their guard down. I glanced up at the smoke detector on the ceiling. I had brought a replacement casing that looked identical to the original, but this one housed a high-definition wide-angle lens. I told Tisha I thought I heard the battery chirping earlier and offered to fix it so it would not wake the baby. She waved her hand dismissively without looking up from her new loot and said, "Just fix it quietly. Brad is sleeping." I grabbed a chair and swapped the covers in less than 10 seconds. It was effortless. I said my goodbyes and walked out the door. Tisha did not even say thank you. She just yelled after me to bring better wine next time because she prefers Pinot Noir. I walked to my car, my heart pounding against my ribs, not from fear, but from anticipation. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled out my tablet with trembling fingers. I opened the security app and waited. A loading circle spun for a seemingly endless moment, and then the screen flickered to life. The image was crystal clear in 4K resolution. I could see Tisha stuffing her face with the snacks I bought, and I could hear Brad walking into the room scratching his back. The audio was crisp. I watched Brad pick up a stack of mail from the counter and throw it onto the table. I heard him say, "Babe, check this out, another bank sent the card." A cold, calculated smile spread across my face. The Trojan horse was inside, and the show was just beginning. For the next 48 hours, I lived two lives. By day, I was Jasmine Sterling, the respectable forensic accountant auditing corporate ledgers. But by night, I was a shadow operator glued to the tablet screen in my darkened bedroom, watching the live feed from inside my own hijacked property. The Trojan horse was working perfectly. The hidden camera in the fiddle leaf fig provided a panoramic view of the living room, while the smoke detector offered a bird's-eye view of the kitchen and dining area. What I saw confirmed every suspicion I had, but it also revealed a darkness I had not anticipated. Brad was not just a lazy husband living off his wife's sister. He was a predator. His daily routine was a masterclass in sloth. He slept until noon, ignored his children, and spent hours playing video games while Tisha cooked and cleaned around him like a maid. But at night, when Tisha went to sleep, the real Brad emerged. Around 2 in the morning, he would shut the blinds and open his laptop on the dining table. I watched as he bypassed standard browsers like Chrome or Safari. He opened a program with a distinctive onion logo, the Tor browser. My heart rate accelerated. You do not use Tor to check sports scores or email your mother. You use it to access the dark web. I sat up in bed, pulling the tablet closer. The high-definition lens I had installed was worth every penny. I could see the reflection of the screen in the window behind him, but I needed more detail. I switched to the feed from the smoke detector, which was directly above him. The angle was steep but clear. Brad was not trading cryptocurrency as he claimed. He was navigating a marketplace that looked like a jagged version of eBay with black backgrounds and neon green text. I watched his fingers fly across the keyboard with a speed and precision he never showed when looking for a job. He was on a forum dedicated to illicit financial services. I saw terms that make any forensic accountant shiver: tumblers, mixers, cleanfuls. In my line of work, I know exactly what those words mean. He was not just browsing, he was shopping for new identities. Full Z is slang for a full package of someone's personal information, including name, social security number, date of birth, and credit history. He was looking to buy stolen lives. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was happening on my Wi-Fi network using my IP address. If the feds traced this activity, it would lead them straight to my front door, not his. He was setting me up to take the fall for federal crimes. I watched him pause and pull out a credit card from his pocket to make a payment. It was a black card. I frowned. Tisha did not have a black card. I didn't even have that specific card. I needed to see the name on it. With trembling fingers, I pinched the screen on my tablet, instructing the 4K camera to digitally zoom in on the plastic rectangle in his hand. The image pixelated for a second before sharpening into terrifying clarity. The digital evidence was damning, but I needed physical proof. I waited until 3 in the morning when the lights in my hijacked house finally went dark. I pulled my black sedan to the curb 2 houses down, keeping the headlights off. The neighborhood was silent, except for the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. I stepped out into the cool night air, pulling my hood up over my braids. I felt like a criminal in my own neighborhood, sneaking up to a property I owned and paid taxes on. I moved quickly, keeping to the shadows of the hedges until I reached the brick pillar of the mailbox at the end of the driveway. My hands were shaking slightly as I reached for the handle. I prayed it was not locked. It creaked softly as it opened, and a white avalanche spilled out onto the pavement. The mailbox was not just full. It was stuffed to the bursting point. I knelt down and started gathering the envelopes using a flashlight app on my phone to scan the return addresses. My breath caught in my throat. There were dozens of letters. The return addresses were a rogues gallery of financial institutions known for easy online accounts. Chime, Green Dot, the Small Business Administration, Department of Labor. But it was the names on the envelopes that made my blood run cold. None of them were addressed to Brad or Tisha. One was for a Marcus Washington, another for a Sarah Jenkins. A third for a deceased woman named Eleanor Rigby. I realized with horror that I was holding a graveyard of stolen lives in my hands. Brad was not just buying identities on the dark web, he was using my investment property as a drop address. He was filing false unemployment claims and applying for fraudulent loans using real people's social security numbers and directing the debit cards here. In the world of forensic accounting, we call this a mule farm. He was harvesting government benefits meant for struggling families and funneling them into his crypto wallet. I shoved as many envelopes as I could into my tote bag, my mind racing. This was no longer a civil dispute about an unwanted house guest. This was federal mail fraud, identity theft, wire fraud. Each letter I shoved into my bag was a felony count carrying a minimum of 5 years in federal prison. I looked back at the house looming in the darkness. Tisha and Brad were sleeping soundly inside, probably dreaming of the free money rolling in. They had no idea that the sister they mocked and dismissed was standing at the end of their driveway collecting the nails for their coffin. I zipped up the bag and sprinted back to my car. I did not go home to sleep. I went straight to my office and turned on the shredder. Not to destroy evidence, but to prepare for the reconstruction of a crime scene. I laid the envelopes out on my conference table. It was time to connect the dots. I watched the live feed from my office, my heart sinking as my parents walked through the front door of my house. They were not there to evict the squatters. They were there as honored guests. Tisha had set the dining table with my fine bone china, the set I was saving for a wedding that never happened, and was playing the role of the accomplished hostess. My mother Verna looked around the room with a satisfied smile, completely ignoring the fact that every piece of furniture, every painting and every fork belonged to the daughter she had disowned. But the real performance was happening at the head of the table. Brad was holding court. He had opened a bottle of my vintage Cabernet and was pouring a glass for my father Otis. Brad was in his element, weaving a web of lies so thick it was suffocating. He leaned in close to my father, his voice low and conspiratorial. He told him that traditional banking was dead. He said the real money was in decentralized finance, and that he had developed an algorithm that guaranteed 200% returns within the first quarter. I watched my father's face. It was an expression I knew well but had never seen directed at me. It was pure, unadulterated admiration. For 30 years, I had brought home straight A report cards, college degrees, and professional accolades. I had built a legitimate career and amassed real wealth. But to Otis Sterling, I was just a worker bee. Brad, however, with his buzzwords and empty promises, was seen as a visionary. My father took a sip of the wine I paid for and nodded enthusiastically. He said finally, "Someone in this family has the guts to take big risks. Jasmine is too conservative, she thinks small." Hearing him dismiss my life's work while sitting in the house, my hard work paid for, felt like a physical blow. But then the tone shifted. Brad glanced toward the camera hidden in the smoke detector, almost as if he sensed he was being watched, but he quickly dismissed it. He reached under the table and pulled out a sleek leather folder. He told my father that because they were family, he wanted to let him in on the ground floor. He said it was an exclusive opportunity, usually reserved for institutional investors. I leaned closer to my screen, trying to see the papers. Brad kept them low below the table edge, shielding them from the casual observer, but my camera caught the corner of the document. It was not an investment prospectus. It looked like a loan application. Brad slid a heavy fountain pen across the tablecloth. He told my father it was just a standard non-disclosure agreement to protect the proprietary algorithm. He lied so smoothly it was terrifying. My mother chimed in, urging Otis to sign, saying they needed to support Brad's genius. Without reading a single line, without asking for a lawyer, my father Otis grabbed the pen. He looked at Brad with pride and said, "I trust you, son." He signed his name with a flourish. I sat back in my chair, feeling a cold dread wash over me. My father had not just signed an NDA. He had likely just authorized a line of credit that would ruin him. The trap was not just for me anymore. It was closing in on all of them. The sterile fluorescent lights of my office hummed overhead as I laid a protective plastic tarp over my mahogany conference table. It was 3 in the morning, but adrenaline kept my mind razor sharp. I hoisted the heavy black garbage bag I had stolen from my own curb and dumped its contents onto the table. The smell of stale beer, rotting pizza crusts, and damp coffee grounds instantly filled the room. Most people would have retched, but to a forensic accountant, this was not trash. This was raw data. I pulled on a pair of blue latex gloves and began the tedious process of sorting. I pushed aside the empty vape cartridges and fast food wrappers, focusing entirely on the paper. Brad was arrogant, but he was not completely stupid. He had used a shredder. However, his laziness was his undoing. He had used a cheap strip-cut shredder instead of a cross-cut one. In my line of work, that is the difference between a dead end and a confession. I gathered the tangled mess of white paper strips and moved them to a light board. For the next 2 hours, the only sound in the office was the hum of the air conditioner and the crinkle of paper as I painstakingly aligned the strips. It was like solving a jigsaw puzzle from hell, but slowly the picture began to emerge. Words started to form in the standard government font I knew so well. Small Business Administration, Payroll Protection Program, Borrower Application. My heart hammered against my ribs. The PPP program had ended months ago, which meant these were backdated applications likely filed through a corrupt lender or a fintech loophole. I used clear tape to fuse the critical section of the document back together. I expected to see Brad's name or perhaps one of the stolen identities from the mailbox. But as I smoothed down the final piece of the signature block, the room seemed to tilt on its axis. The applicant was not a stranger. The name printed in bold black ink was Otis Sterling. My father. I stared at the document, my hands shaking in my latex gloves. The application claimed my father ran a consulting firm with 10 employees and a monthly payroll of $20,000. It was a complete fabrication. My father has been retired for 5 years and spends his days gardening. Brad was not just stealing from the government. He was using my parents' clean credit history and their naive trust to commit federal bank fraud. I looked at the signature line. It was my father's handwriting, shaky but authentic. The document Brad had made him sign under the table was not a non-disclosure agreement. It was this. Brad was setting them up. If the feds audited this loan, Brad would claim he was just a helpful son-in-law, while my father would be the one facing 30 years in prison for signing a false instrument. He was not just robbing them. He was turning my parents into federal fugitives without them even knowing the crime. The afternoon silence of the cul-de-sac was shattered by the aggressive roar of a twin-turbo engine. I was sitting at my desk reviewing a forensic audit for a commercial client when the vibration rattled my coffee cup. I pulled up the live security feed from the camera, hidden in the smoke detector, and saw a monstrosity rolling into my driveway. It was a brand new Ford Raptor finished in a menacing agate black paint with custom 37-inch mud-terrain tires and a suspension lift that made it tower over the hedges. A truck like this does not just cost money, it screams for attention. With the dealer markup and the visible modifications, I estimated the price tag to be close to $90,000. Brad opened the driver door and hopped down wearing mirrored aviator sunglasses and a grin that looked predatory. He looked like the king of the world, or at least the king of my driveway. Tisha ran out of the front door squealing with delight, her hands covering her mouth in mock surprise. She threw her arms around his neck and he spun her around, pointing at the truck as if he had just hunted a beast and brought it home for dinner. My parents followed them out a moment later. My father, Otis, walked around the vehicle with a look of reverence I had never seen him direct toward anything I had ever achieved. He ran his hand along the glossy fender and kicked the massive tires, nodding in approval. I turned up the volume on my feed. Brad was loudly explaining that this was a little bonus from his latest yield farming strategy. He told them that in the crypto world you have to treat yourself when the harvest is good. My father patted him on the back and said he was proud of him for having the courage to dream big. He made a comment about how driving a Corolla like I did was fine for a worker bee, but a leader needs a chariot. The insult stung, but I pushed it down. I was not a worker bee. I was an exterminator, and I had work to do. I froze the video frame as Brad moved away from the rear of the truck. The license plate was clearly visible in high definition. I opened the Georgia Department of Revenue Vehicle Registration database on my second monitor. My fingers flew across the keys as I entered the tag number. I expected to see Brad's name, or perhaps a leasing company. The search wheels spun for a moment, and then the result populated in stark black letters. The registered owner was Blue Horizon Consulting LLC. My breath hitched in my throat. That was the same shell company name listed on the fraudulent PPP loan application I had pieced together from the shredded trash the night before. The reality of the crime hit me with the force of a physical blow. Brad had not used investment profits to buy this truck. He had taken the federal funds that were legally restricted for payroll and business rent, and he had used them to purchase a luxury personal asset. This was textbook money laundering and misappropriation of government funds. By registering it in the company name, he thought he was being clever, writing it off as a business expense. But a consulting firm with no employees does not need a monster truck. I watched on the screen as my father climbed into the driver's seat, gripping the leather steering wheel with a wide smile. He was revving the engine, laughing as the exhaust boomed against the garage door. He had no idea that he was sitting inside a felony. He was celebrating the very weight that was about to drag him to the bottom of the ocean. The first massive concrete block of debt had just been tied around his neck, and he was thanking the executioner for the privilege. The blue light of my monitors cast long shadows across my office walls as I continued to map out the spiderweb of Brad's financial transactions. I had just linked the shell company to a bank account in the Cayman Islands when my personal cell phone vibrated violently against the desk surface. It was a text message from a number I did not recognize, but the tone was unmistakable. It read simply, "Back off, Jasmine. I know about the cash payments from your tenant in the Midtown condo. If you do not stop digging, I will report you to the IRS for tax evasion." I stared at the screen for a moment, and then a dry, humorless laugh escaped my lips. It was the laugh of a professional who realizes they are dealing with an amateur. Brad was trying to blackmail a forensic accountant with a tax threat. It was like trying to threaten a shark with water. He was projecting his own criminal mindset onto me. Because he lived his life in the gray areas of the law, he assumed everyone else did too. He assumed that because I had tenants, I must be skimming cash off the top to lower my tax bracket. He thought he had found my leverage point. He thought this threat would make me scramble to delete files and beg for a truce. He was spectacularly wrong. What Brad did not understand is that my entire career is built on transparency. I document every single penny. I report every dime of rental income, every deductible expense, and every asset depreciation. My tax returns are so clean you could eat off them. I have audit insurance specifically for this reason. I am bulletproof. But this text message told me something very important. It told me that he was scared. He had noticed the inquiries into his credit report, or perhaps he had seen the way I looked at the truck. He knew the walls were closing in, and he was lashing out like a trapped animal. He was trying to create a stalemate, a situation of mutually assured destruction where we both walked away to protect our secrets. But I had no secrets to protect. I picked up the phone and typed a reply. I did not defend myself. I did not get angry. I simply wrote, "Go ahead. Here is the number for the tip line." I hit send and watched the delivery receipt turn to read. He wanted to bring the Internal Revenue Service into this fight. He wanted to invite the most ruthless financial investigators on the planet to take a look at our family's finances. I leaned back in my chair and interlaced my fingers behind my head. If he wanted the IRS involved, I would be more than happy to facilitate that introduction. In fact, I was counting on it. Because when the IRS started looking for my alleged missing rental income, they were going to stumble right over his fraudulent PPP loans, his money laundering shell companies, and my father's falsified tax documents. He had just threatened me with the very weapon I was planning to use to destroy him. I turned back to my screens with a renewed sense of purpose. The game had just changed. He thought he was calling the cops on me. He had no idea he was dialing his own executioner. The adrenaline from Brad's empty threat had barely faded when a different kind of alert popped up on my laptop screen. It was a message request on Facebook sitting in the filtered folder where spam and scams usually go to die. The profile picture showed a tired-looking woman holding a cat, and the name was Elena Rodriguez. I almost deleted it without reading. I assumed it was hate mail from one of Tisha's followers who had bought into her sob story. But the preview text stopped my finger hovering over the mouse. It said simply, "I saw your sister video. He did it to me too." My heart skipped a beat. I clicked open the message. Elena wrote that she had dated Brad 3 years ago in Savannah. Back then, he was not a crypto genius. He was posing as a high-end car importer. She told me he had charmed her family, ate at their table, and eventually convinced her to invest her entire savings of $50,000 into a shipping container of luxury parts that never arrived. When she asked for the money back, he vanished. He changed his number, blocked her on everything, and left her with nothing but debt and a broken heart. I felt a cold chill spread through my body. This was not just a lazy brother-in-law mooching off his wife's family. This was a predator. A serial scammer who moved from victim to victim, refining his pitch and leaving destruction in his wake. I immediately opened a background check software and ran Elena's name. There it was. A civil lawsuit filed in Chatham County against a Bradley Jenkins 2 years ago. It was dismissed without prejudice, likely because he had no assets to seize, and she ran out of money for lawyers. The legal system had failed her just like it was failing me. But she had something I did not have. She had history. She had text messages, bank transfers, and a timeline that proved a pattern of racketeering. I typed back, my fingers flying across the keys. I told her I believed her. I told her I was going to take him down and I needed her help. I watched the typing indicator wave for a moment, and then her reply appeared. She said she would do anything to see him in handcuffs. We set a time to meet the following day at a diner on the outskirts of the city, far away from prying eyes and hidden cameras. I closed the laptop with a terrifying realization. My parents were not just dealing with a bad investment, they were the latest marks in a long con. And for the first time in this nightmare, I realized I was not fighting alone. I knew that to destroy a conspiracy, you do not attack the leader directly, you severed the weakest link. In this operation, the weakest link was my sister Tisha. She was not a mastermind, she was simply greedy and easily bored. I waited until I saw the black Ford Raptor roar down the street, leaving Tisha alone in the house. I walked up to the front door clutching a sleek black portfolio. I did not pound on the door this time. I knocked gently. When Tisha answered, she looked annoyed, holding a glass of wine at 10 in the morning. She started to close the door in my face, but I held up a single piece of paper. It was a cashier's check made out to her name for $50,000. It was not real, of course it was a voided copy used for negotiation purposes, but to her it looked like a golden ticket. I told her I was tired of fighting. I told her I wanted my house back and I was willing to pay for it. I explained the concept of cash for keys. I told her if they were out in 72 hours, the 50 grand was hers to keep, no questions asked. I watched the transformation in her face. The annoyance vanished, replaced instantly by a hunger that was almost feral. Her eyes locked onto the zeros on the paper. She did not see a bribe. She saw a shopping spree at Lenox Square. She saw a down payment on a luxury apartment where she could pretend to be rich without the hassle of a lawsuit. I asked her if she needed to call Brad to discuss it. I knew that question was the bait. Tisha scoffed and tossed her hair. She said she did not need Brad's permission for anything. She said since she was the one dealing with the stress of my harassment, she deserved the compensation. She grabbed the pen from my hand and signed the agreement to vacate without even reading the fine print. She was so blinded by the promise of immediate cash that she did not realize she had just agreed to dismantle Brad's base of operations without his consent. She had just sold out her husband for the price of a luxury SUV. I folded the signed document and walked back to my car, hiding a smile. I knew exactly what would happen when Brad came home and found out she had agreed to leave. He needed this address for his scams. She just wanted the money. I had just lit the fuse of a bomb that would blow their marriage apart from the inside. The divide and conquer strategy had officially begun. The vibration on my wrist was the final fail-safe. Years ago, I had set up credit monitoring for my parents after a minor phishing scare, and I had never removed my number from the account. The notification flashed across my watch screen with terrifying clarity. Hard inquiry, First National Bank. Amount $300,000, secured by real estate. The timestamp was 2 minutes ago. They were not just talking about it. They were signing the papers right now. I did not think. I did not calculate. I grabbed my keys and sprinted out of my office. I drove like a madwoman, weaving through traffic and ignoring speed limits until I screeched into the bank parking lot. I saw the black Ford Raptor parked right in the front space like a conqueror's chariot. I bypassed the confused security guard and marched straight toward the branch manager's glass office at the back of the lobby. Through the window, I saw the pen in my father's hand. He was hovering over the signature line of a thick document. Brad was leaning in close, practically salivating, his eyes fixed on the ink. I threw the door open with enough force to bang it against the wall. Brad looked up, his eyes widening in mock surprise, but I ignored him completely. I lunged across the mahogany desk and snatched the document out from under my father's hand, crumbling the paper in my fist. I screamed that it was a scam. I screamed that Brad was stealing their home and that there was no liquidity pool. I turned to the bank manager, breathless and frantic, telling him to stop the transaction because the borrower was being coerced. The room went dead silent. I expected my father to look confused. I expected him to ask questions or perhaps look at the document I had just saved him from signing. Instead, he stood up slowly, shaking with rage. He did not look at the evidence I was holding. He looked at me with pure hatred. He raised his hand, and before I could flinch, he struck me across the face. The sound of the slap echoed through the quiet bank lobby, sharp and brutal. My head snapped to the side and my cheek burned with a sudden, intense heat. But the pain in my chest was far worse. My father stood over me, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. He pointed a trembling finger at the door and shouted at the top of his lungs for everyone to hear. He called me a jealous saboteur. He said I was an ungrateful child who could not stand to see anyone else succeed because I was miserable and alone. He told me to get out of his sight and never come back. I stood there stunned, holding the crumpled paper that would have saved him while the bank staff stared in horror. I realized then that I had lost him completely. He chose the lie because the lie made him feel important. I turned and walked out, the red mark on my face throbbing, a physical brand of my exile. The security guard did not handle me with care. He was a large man doing his job, and to him I was just a hysterical woman disturbing the peace of a financial institution. He grabbed my upper arm with a grip like a vice and hauled me backward away from the glass office. I did not fight him. I did not scream anymore. My voice had died in my throat the moment my father's hand connected with my face. I was numb. My feet dragged across the polished marble floor, but my eyes remained locked on the scene unfolding behind the glass partition. It played out like a silent horror movie. I watched Brad lean in close to my parents, placing a comforting hand on my father's shoulder. He was playing the role of the protector, soothing them after the assault by their crazy daughter. He said something that made my mother nod vigorously, wiping a tear from her eye. She looked at the door where I was being dragged out with a look of pure disappointment. Then came the moment that sealed their fate. Brad slid the document back across the desk. He smoothed out the wrinkles I had made in the paper. He handed his heavy, expensive fountain pen to my father. Time seemed to slow down. I wanted to smash the glass. I wanted to trigger the fire alarm. I wanted to do anything to stop the ink from hitting the paper. But I was powerless. I watched my father, Otis Sterling, a man who had worked double shifts at the factory to buy that house 30 years ago, press the nib to the page. He signed his name. Then he passed the pen to my mother. She signed hers. It was done. In that split second, 3 decades of equity, security, and memories were transferred into the hands of a con artist. They had just signed their own death warrant, and they did it with a sense of righteous defiance against me. The guard shoved me through the revolving doors, and I stumbled out onto the concrete sidewalk, the humid city air hitting me like a physical weight. He told me to stay off the property, or he would call the police. I stood there alone in the parking lot, staring at the bank logo. The adrenaline crashed, leaving me shaking. I reached up and touched the corner of my mouth. My fingers came away stained with a smudge of bright red blood where my tooth had cut my lip. I stared at the blood on my fingertip. It was the physical cost of my loyalty. I had thrown myself in front of the train to save them, and they had pushed me off the tracks so they could keep walking toward the engine. I took a deep breath, inhaling the exhaust fumes of the passing traffic. A cold, hard resolve settled over me. I had done my duty. I had tried to intervene. I had offered them the truth, and they had chosen the lie. I wiped the blood away with the back of my hand. The time for saving them was over. Now it was just about the math. I drove back to my office in silence. The stinging on my cheek had faded to a dull throb, but the clarity in my mind was absolute. I did not go home to ice my face. I did not call a friend to vent. I went straight to my desk and unlocked my secure server. The time for emotional appeals was over. The time for forensic execution had begun. I pulled up the master file labeled Operation Eviction, but I renamed it immediately. I typed in the new header, United States versus Bradley Jenkins. I was no longer a daughter trying to save her parents. I was a witness compiling a federal dossier. I began to upload the final pieces of the puzzle. First came the video footage of the mailbox theft, clearly showing Brad handling federal correspondence addressed to strangers. Next, I attached the reconstructed PPP loan application, proving he had used my father's identity to defraud the Small Business Administration. Then I added the vehicle registration for the Ford Raptor, linking the stolen government funds directly to his personal assets. But the centerpiece of the file was the transaction that had just happened. I pulled the preliminary data from the county clerk's digital intake, which showed the pending lien on my parents' home. In the eyes of the law, targeting vulnerable seniors and manipulating them into liquidating their life savings is a specific and heinous crime. It is called elder financial abuse. I calculated the total damages. Between the fraudulent business loans, the unemployment scams, the credit card fraud, and now the theft of my parents' equity, the total sum of misappropriated funds was staggering. $1.2 million. This was not petty theft. This was grand larceny on a scale that carries a mandatory minimum sentence in federal prison. I opened my email client and composed a new message. I did not send it to a general tip line where it might get lost in the noise. I typed in the direct address of Special Agent Miller. We had worked together 2 years ago on a corporate embezzlement case. He was a man who hated fraudsters almost as much as I did. In the body of the email, I wrote simply, Agent Miller, I have a priority case for you, multiple counts of wire fraud, bank fraud, and aggravated identity theft. The suspect is a flight risk. All evidence is attached. I attached the zipped folder containing the video files, the audio recordings, and the forensic audit. I hovered my mouse over the send button. My finger did not tremble. My father had slapped me for trying to stop this. Now I was doing the only thing that could actually save them from total ruin. I clicked the mouse. The progress bar zipped across the screen and the message vanished into the ether. The investigation was now live. The clock was ticking. The notification on my phone buzzed at 8 o'clock sharp, signaling that a large wire transfer had cleared into the account Brad controlled. $300,000. My parents' life savings had officially left their possession and entered the hands of a thief. Inside my house, the celebration began almost immediately. Through the security feed, I watched as Brad kicked open the front door carrying cases of expensive champagne and bags of gourmet food. He was manic with energy, fueled by the adrenaline of the con. He wasn't just happy, he was triumphant. He cranked the stereo system up to maximum volume, shaking the very walls I had paid for. But a private celebration was not enough for narcissists like them. They needed an audience. I received a notification that Tisha had started a live video on Instagram. I opened the app on my tablet and sat back to watch the show. The caption read, simply, "New life, new money, hat blessed." The video opened with a close-up of Tisha's face, heavily filtered and beaming. She was holding a bottle of Ace of Spades champagne, which retails for $300 a bottle. She spun the camera around to show Brad standing at my dining table. He was doing something that would make any defense attorney weep. He was fanning out stacks of $100 bills, arranging them in a pile next to his car keys. He looked at the camera and shouted that this was what happens when you trust the process. He claimed it was the first return on his algorithm. I knew better. He had gone to the bank and withdrawn cash from the equity line just to look rich for the internet. Tisha turned the camera back to herself and walked out onto the balcony. She looked out over the city lights and let out a squeal of delight. Then her face hardened into a smirk. She told her followers that she had a message for the haters, specifically the ones in her own family. She said she was finally free from the toxic energy that had been holding them back. She looked directly into the lens and said she was glad to be done with her evil sister, who tried to sabotage their success out of jealousy. She called me a bitter, lonely woman who couldn't stand to see them shine. Brad came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissing her neck. They laughed together, drunk on stolen money and delusion. They thought they had won. They thought the money in their account was a ticket to freedom. They had no idea it was actually the primary evidence in a federal indictment. I sat in the silence of my temporary apartment, the glow of the screen illuminating my face. I reached for my own glass of wine. It was a vintage Pinot Noir, the kind Tisha had demanded I buy for her just days ago. I swirled the dark red liquid and watched them dance on the grave of our parents' retirement. I did not feel anger anymore. I felt a cold, absolute certainty. I raised my glass to the screen, to the sister who had betrayed me, and the brother-in-law who had underestimated me. I took a slow, deliberate sip. Enjoy the champagne, Tisha. It is the last vintage you will be drinking for a very long time. The party ends tomorrow. The darkest hour is not just a metaphor, it is a tactical advantage. At 4 a.m, the city was a ghost town draped in a heavy silence that felt like a held breath. I drove my sedan slowly through the empty streets, keeping my headlights off as I approached the entrance of the subdivision. I did not pull into my own driveway. I parked a full block away, tucked behind a row of privacy hedges where I had a clear line of sight but remained invisible to the house. I killed the engine and rolled down the window, letting the cool pre-dawn air fill the cabin. Down the street, my house sat dark and silent. The thumping bass and the drunken laughter from the night before had finally faded. Brad and Tisha were inside, sleeping off the champagne and the euphoria of their perceived victory. They were likely dreaming of spending the money they had stolen from my parents. They had no idea that their wake-up call was about to be delivered by the United States government. I picked up my phone and dialed the private number for the neighborhood security manager. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy and confused. He asked who was calling at this ungodly hour. I kept my voice calm and professional, the voice of a woman executing a business transaction. I told him that within 60 seconds a convoy of vehicles would be approaching the main gate. I instructed him to lift the barrier immediately and to disable the visitor announcement system. He started to protest, asking if I was authorizing a moving crew or a delivery service. I cut him off. I told him that these were not movers. I told him that if he did not open the gate, he would be obstructing a federal investigation. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the frantic sound of keys typing and a nervous agreement. He understood. This was not a request. It was a warning. I hung up the phone and turned my gaze to the main road. A moment later, they appeared. It started as a low rumble, barely audible at first, growing steadily into a deep mechanical hum that vibrated in my chest. Then the headlights cut through the darkness. One pair, then two, then four. A procession of massive black Chevrolet Tahoes turned the corner, moving with a synchronized precision that was terrifying to behold. They did not use sirens. They did not flash red and blue lights. They moved in stealth mode like predators stalking prey. These were not local police responding to a noise complaint. This was the FBI. The lead vehicle slowed as it approached the gate, which rose instantly in silent obedience. As the convoy rolled past my hiding spot, I caught a glimpse of the passengers, grim-faced men and women in tactical vests checking their weapons. The executioners had arrived. I watched the taillights disappear around the curve, heading straight for the house where my family lay sleeping. The party was officially over. 5 o'clock arrived with the precision of a stopwatch. The sky was still a bruised purple, hovering somewhere between night and dawn when the silence of the suburbs was shattered forever. From my vantage point down the street, I saw the tactical team move into position. They flowed like water, surrounding the perimeter of my property in seconds. There was no knocking. There was no polite request for entry. The amplified voice of the lead agent hit the neighborhood like a physical shockwave, echoing off the brick facades of the sleeping houses. This is the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Occupants of the residence, come out with your hands up. We have a warrant for your arrest. The announcement hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Then all hell broke loose. I saw the flash before I heard the sound. 2 canisters crashed through the front bay windows, shattering the expensive double-paned glass I had installed last year. A split second later, a blinding white light pulsed from inside the living room, followed by the deafening boom of flashbang grenades. They were designed to disorient and stun, to turn a suspect's senses into mush before they could reach for a weapon or a shredder. The front door, a custom piece of solid mahogany that I had picked out myself, did not stand a chance. A team of 4 agents wielding a heavy battering ram swung at once. The lockjam splintered with a sickening crack that I could hear from a block away. The door swung inward, and the black wave of tactical gear poured into the foyer. "Federal agents, get down! Get on the ground now!" The shouting was overlapping, rhythmic, and terrifyingly loud. It was the sound of absolute authority. I rolled down my window an inch further, needing to hear the result of my work. Above the barked commands of the FBI agents, I heard them. The screams. First, it was Tisha. It wasn't the annoyed whine she used when she didn't get her way. It was a primal shriek of pure terror, the sound of someone waking up from a champagne dream to find a rifle pointed at their face. Then came Brad. He wasn't negotiating. He wasn't using his smooth talk or his buzzwords. He was shouting incoherently, likely blinded by the flashbangs and scrambling in panic. I imagined them in their silk pajamas, surrounded by the remnants of their party, being forced face down onto the cold hardwood floors. The neighbors' porch lights began to flick on one by one, creating a spotlight for the chaos. They were waking up to see the successful crypto family being dismantled by a SWAT team. The illusion Brad had built so carefully didn't just crack. It exploded. The sun had just crested the horizon, casting a golden spotlight on the tragedy unfolding on my front lawn. The neighbors, drawn by the flashbangs and the shouting, were lining the sidewalks in their bathrobes, holding coffee cups like spectators at a parade. They had seen Brad strutting around for weeks, revving his truck and looking down on them. Now they were about to see the real Bradley Jenkins. He did not walk out of the house with his head held high. He was dragged out. 2 large federal agents gripped him by the arms, his feet scuffing uselessly against the pavement. The crypto genius who had bragged about controlling the market couldn't even control his own legs. He was stripped of his designer suits and his arrogance, wearing nothing but a pair of black boxer briefs. He was a sobbing, shivering mess. He was hyperventilating, pleading with the agents in a high-pitched, unintelligible wail that sounded nothing like the confident baritone he used on his phone calls. As they hauled him past the Ford Raptor he loved so much, the ultimate humiliation occurred. A dark, wet stain began to spread rapidly across the front of his underwear, running down his thigh. The crowd went silent, and then a ripple of murmurs broke out. The man who had threatened to ruin me, the man who had stolen my parents' dignity, had wet himself in sheer terror. He was not a wolf. He was a scared child playing dress-up, and the costume had just been ripped away. Tisha followed a moment later, but she was not crying. She was screaming. She was fighting the female agent who held her, twisting her body and kicking out with her bare feet. Her face was twisted into a mask of confused rage. She spotted the neighbors, and then she spotted the lead agent. She screamed at the top of her lungs that this was a mistake. She yelled that they had the wrong person. She pointed frantically at the house and shrieked that she didn't own it. She yelled my name. She shouted that the house belonged to Jasmine Sterling, that I was the landlord, and that they should be arresting me. She was trying to frame me even as the handcuffs were being locked onto her wrists. She truly believed that because the deed was in my name, the crimes committed inside were my problem. The lead agent, a tall man with a face like carved granite, did not even blink. He stopped in the middle of the driveway and turned to face them. He pulled a folded document from his tactical vest. He did not shout. He spoke with a deadly calm precision that cut through Tisha's screaming like a knife. He told them that ownership of the property was irrelevant to the operation of a criminal enterprise. He raised the warrant and read the charges loud enough for the entire neighborhood to hear. Conspiracy to commit wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, and theft of government property. Tisha went silent, her mouth hanging open. The reality finally hit her. They weren't being evicted. They were being indicted. The agent signaled his team and they shoved Brad and Tisha toward the waiting SUVs. The show was over. The villains were in chains. I thought the raid was finished when Brad and Tisha were secured in the back of the government SUVs, but the federal agents were not done. They turned back toward the house, their weapons still drawn. 2 minutes later, the front door opened again and my heart finally broke. My parents, Otis and Verna, were led out into the harsh morning light. They looked nothing like the arrogant high rollers who had looked down on me at the bank yesterday. They looked frail and confused. My father was wearing his striped pajamas, and my mother was clutching her robe around her chest, her hair in disarray. They blinked rapidly against the rising sun, struggling to comprehend how their retirement dream had turned into a tactical assault. An agent held each of them by the arm, guiding them down the front steps where the shattered glass of my windows crunched under their slippers. When the agent pulled a pair of metal handcuffs from his belt, my father finally snapped out of his daze. He jerked his arm away, his face turning a deep shade of crimson. He began to shout at the young officer, desperate to save face in front of the neighbors who were now filming with their phones. He puffed out his chest and yelled that there was a terrible misunderstanding. He screamed that he was a victim, not a criminal. He pointed toward the police car where Brad was slumped and shouted that he was just an investor and that his son-in-law handled the business details. He demanded to speak to a supervisor, expecting his age and his indignation to buy him special treatment. The lead agent who had silenced Tisha walked over to my father. He did not offer sympathy. He offered facts. He held up a plastic evidence bag containing the wet ink documents they had just seized from the dining table. He looked my father in the eye and spoke with a volume that carried to where I was parked. He told him that according to federal records, Otis Sterling was not an investor. He was the registered agent and CEO of Blue Horizon Consulting. He explained that because Otis had signed the fraudulent loan applications and the shell company and corporation papers, he was legally the principal architect of the fraud. My father opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. The agent told him he could explain his side to the federal prosecutor after he was processed. The handcuffs clicked shut around my father's wrists. The sound was small, but final. My mother began to weep softly, her legs giving out as she realized the gravity of the situation. They were led past the Ford Raptor they had been so proud of just hours ago. They were placed into a separate transport van, a heavy reinforced vehicle with caged windows. I watched through my windshield as the doors slammed shut on my entire family. Brad, Tisha, Otis, Verna. They were all gone. The convoy of black SUVs began to roll out of the subdivision, moving in a slow, solemn procession. I sat alone in my car, the engine cold, the silence of the neighborhood slowly returning. I had won the war. I had saved my credit and reclaimed my property. But as I watched the taillights disappear around the corner, I realized the price of victory. I was the last sterling left standing. The black SUVs formed a funeral procession for a lifestyle that never truly existed. I sat in my sedan with the engine idling. I pressed the button on the door panel, and the driver's side window hummed down. The cool morning air rushed in, carrying the scent of exhaust fumes and freshly cut grass. I reached up and removed my dark sunglasses, hooking them onto the collar of my blouse. I wanted there to be no mistake. I wanted them to know exactly who was watching. I wanted to look my decision in the eye without a filter. The heavy transport van crawled past my vehicle. It moved slowly, heavy with the weight of its cargo. Through the reinforced wire mesh and the thick tinted glass, I saw a flash of movement. It was my mother. She was pressed against the window, looking out at the world she was leaving behind. Her eyes scanned the street, and then they locked onto mine. For a heartbeat time suspended, I saw the shock register on her tear-stained face. She realized in that split second that I was not just a bystander. I was the architect. Her expression shifted from confusion to a mask of pure, desperate agony. She slammed her open palms against the glass. Her mouth opened wide in a scream that I could see but could not hear. Her throat strained with the effort. She was shouting my name. She was begging for help. Or perhaps she was cursing me for betraying the family code. The soundproof glass swallowed her voice completely, reducing her to a silent pantomime of despair. It was a terrifying image, a mother screaming at her child from inside a cage, but I did not look away. I did not blink. I let her see my face one last time. It was a face stripped of pity. I had offered her a lifeboat so many times, and she had drilled holes in the hull to spite me. Now she was drowning, and I was simply watching the water rise. The van turned the corner and broke our line of sight. She was gone. The street was empty again. I pressed the button and the glass slid up, sealing me back inside my quiet sanctuary. I put the car in gear. The engine purred to life, a steady and reliable sound. I turned the steering wheel and pulled away from the curb, driving in the opposite direction. I did not look in the rearview mirror. There was nothing behind me worth saving. The interrogation room inside the federal building was designed to strip a man of his soul. It was a windowless concrete box with a single flickering fluorescent light that hummed with a headache-inducing frequency. The air was cold, recycled, and smelled of stale coffee and fear. Brad sat at the metal table, handcuffed to a steel ring bolted to the floor. The designer suit he usually wore like armor had been replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loosely on his frame. He was no longer the confident alpha male who drove a Ford Raptor and lectured people on yield farming. He was a shivering, pathetic figure huddled in the chair, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rodent. Across the table sat Special Agent Miller. Miller did not shout. He did not slam his fist on the table. He simply opened a thick file folder and laid out a series of photographs: the fake business licenses, the car registration, the bank transfers, and finally the mortgage documents signed by my parents. Miller looked at Brad with a mixture of boredom and disgust. He told Brad that they had him on 30 counts of wire fraud and that the mandatory minimum sentence was looking like 20 years. He mentioned that federal prison was not a pleasant place for a soft-handed scammer who liked expensive skincare products. That was all it took. The dam broke. Brad did not ask for a lawyer. He asked for a deal. He leaned forward, the chains of his handcuffs rattling against the table, and he began to talk. But he didn't confess to his own greed. He did something far worse. He projected it onto his victims. Brad looked the agent in the eye and spun a tale of victimization that was breathtaking in its audacity. He claimed that he was just a consultant, a tech guy who was trying to help his wife's family navigate the digital age. He claimed that the real mastermind was Otis Sterling. Brad's voice gained strength as he warmed to the lie. He told the agent that my father was a tyrant, a man obsessed with money and status, who was bitter about never being rich. He said that Otis had forced him to set up the shell companies. He claimed that Otis had threatened to cut Tisha off if Brad didn't find a way to get them government grants. He pointed a shaking finger at the signature on the loan documents. He told Miller to look at the ink. He said those were Otis's signatures, not his. He said he was just following orders from a domineering father-in-law who wanted to live the high life. He painted my father as the shark and himself as the innocent minnow caught in the net. He threw the people who had clothed him, fed him, and worshipped him into the fire without a second of hesitation. He sold them out to save himself from a single day in a cell. In the observation room next door, the audio feed was being piped into a small speaker. My parents were sitting on a wooden bench, still wearing their pajamas, huddled together for warmth. A female officer stood by the door, her face impassive. She had played the recording so they could understand the reality of their situation. At first, Otis had listened with a look of confusion, shaking his head and muttering that there was a mistake. He was waiting for Brad to explain the strategy to use his genius to fix this. But as Brad's voice filled the room describing Otis as a greedy, manipulative criminal who orchestrated the entire fraud, the confusion turned to horror. Otis sat frozen. His mouth hung open slightly, his eyes wide and unblinking. He was listening to the son he never had describe him as a monster. He heard the man he had mortgaged his home for call him a greedy old man who deserved what was coming to him. The betrayal was absolute. It was a physical blow, sharper and more devastating than any weapon. The color drained from my father's face, leaving it a sickly shade of gray. His chest hitched. He reached out a trembling hand and grabbed my mother's arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. He tried to speak, perhaps to deny it, perhaps to curse, but no sound came out. His eyes rolled back into his head. His grip went slack. Otis Sterling, the proud patriarch who had slapped his own daughter to protect a con artist, slumped sideways. He hit the linoleum floor with a heavy, dull thud. My mother screamed, a raw, piercing sound that echoed through the sterile hallway. She fell to her knees beside him, shaking his limp body, begging him to wake up. But the damage was done. The truth had not just set them free, it had crushed them. The forensic team moved through my rental property with the destructive efficiency of termites. They were not there to preserve the decor. They were there to uncover the rot. I had authorized a destructive search warrant, giving them permission to tear the place apart if necessary to find the assets. In the master bedroom, the room where Brad had spent his nights scheming and recording his arrogant videos, a K9 unit began to bark frantically. The dog scratched at the expensive laminate flooring inside the walk-in closet, its claws gouging the faux wood. An agent signaled for the crowbars. With a sickening crunch of splintering wood, they pried up the floorboards that Brad had installed himself just a month prior. He hadn't done the renovation to improve the property value. He had done it to build a vault. Underneath the subflooring lay a hollowed-out cavity lined with lead tape to block X-rays. Inside, nestled in a bed of pink fiberglass insulation, were two items that defined Bradley Jenkins' entire existence. The first was a Ledger Nano X, a hardware cryptocurrency wallet that looked like a sleek silver thumb drive. This was the digital coffin where my parents' retirement money, the stolen PPP funds, and Elena's savings were buried. But next to it lay the dark secret that no one, not even his wife, had known about. It was a gallon-sized freezer bag filled with jagged, cloudy crystals that caught the beam of the tactical flashlight. Methamphetamine, high-grade uncut, and enough to warrant a trafficking charge on its own. Miles away in the interrogation room, Tisha was still trying to play the role of the indignant victim. She sat with her arms crossed, tapping her foot, demanding to be released so she could sue the government for harassment. She truly believed that Brad was a financial genius who had just cut a few corners. She thought this was white-collar persecution. The door opened, and Agent Miller walked in carrying a clear plastic evidence bag. He didn't say a word. He simply tossed the bag onto the metal table. It landed with a heavy slap. Tisha recoiled, staring at the crystals. She asked what it was. She asked if they were planting drugs on her husband. She screamed that Brad was a health fanatic who drank kale smoothies and meditated. She said he would never touch poison like that. Miller sat down and laid out the photos of the hidden compartment in the floor. He explained the timeline. He showed her the bank withdrawals from her own personal account, the cash she thought was going into yield farming, and liquidity pools. He traced the money. It didn't go to Binance or Coinbase. It went to a street dealer in South Atlanta. He explained the behavior she had likely ignored for months. The erratic sleep schedules, the manic bursts of energy followed by days of depression, the paranoia, the delusions of grandeur, the sudden aggressive sexual demands, the weight loss. It wasn't the stress of being a CEO. It was the frantic burning high of a crystal meth addiction. Tisha stared at the bag of drugs, her face draining of color. Her entire world collapsed in that sterile room. She realized that every time she had defended him, every time she had handed him cash, every time she had lied to her family for him, she wasn't funding an empire. She was funding a junkie's habit. She wasn't the wife of a crypto king. She was the enabler of a drug addict who had smoked her inheritance and snorted her parents' house. The realization hit her physically. She gagged, covering her mouth with her hand as bile rose in her throat. The man she had worshipped, the man she had chosen over her own sister, was nothing more than a hollow shell filled with chemicals and lies. She looked up at the agent, her eyes swimming with tears of absolute humiliation. There were no more excuses. There was no more us against the world. There was only the cold, hard rock on the table and the realization that she had destroyed her life for a hallucination. The truth was finally naked, ugly, and undeniable. 6 months is a long time in the real world, but in the federal court system, it is the blink of an eye. I walked into the courtroom wearing a tailored navy suit that was sharp enough to cut glass. I was not there as a sister. I was not there as a daughter. I was listed on the docket as the government's primary forensic expert witness. The room was cold and smelled of floor wax and old wood. The gallery was packed with reporters and onlookers drawn to the sensational story of the crypto king, who turned out to be a meth-addicted predator. I did not look at the cameras. My focus was singular. I walked past the defense table where Brad sat. The change in him was startling. The prison diet and the withdrawal from methamphetamine had stripped him down to the bone. He looked gray, gaunt, and small. His designer suit had been replaced by ill-fitting court clothes that hung off his shoulders. He tried to catch my eye, looking for a shred of pity or perhaps a hint of familial guilt. I gave him nothing. I looked right through him as if he were a rounding error in a spreadsheet. I took the stand and swore the oath. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Rodriguez, asked me to state my credentials. I listed my degrees, my certifications, and my years of experience in forensic accounting. Then she asked me to explain the exhibits. This was the moment I had prepared for. I opened my laptop and connected it to the main projector. A complex web of transactions filled the screens around the room. I did not use emotional language. I did not call him a monster. I used math. I explained the flow of funds with the clinical precision of a surgeon. I showed the jury exactly how the money moved. I traced the wire transfer of $300,000 from my parents' equity line. I showed how it hit Brad's account at 9:00 a.m. I showed the withdrawal at 9:45 a.m. I showed the deposit into a shell account in the Caymans at 10:00 a.m. Then came the kill shot. I overlaid the transaction timestamps with his text messages and his GPS data. I showed the jury that at the exact moment he told my parents he was locking in a liquidity position, he was actually transferring $40,000 to a luxury car dealership. I showed them the receipts for the Airbnb in Tulum. I showed the $5,000 withdrawals at ATMs located inside strip clubs. I showed the payments to the known drug associate, The numbers on the screen were bright red and they were damning. I looked at the jury and explained that there was no investment algorithm. There was no trading bot. There was only a Ponzi scheme where the new money from my parents was used to pay for the lifestyle he could no longer afford. The silence in the room was absolute. The jurors were not looking at a businessman who made a mistake. They were looking at a vampire who had sucked his wife's family dry to buy drugs and toys. Brad's defense attorney, a court-appointed lawyer who looked exhausted, stood up to cross-examine me. It was a futile effort. He tried to attack my character. He asked if I had a personal vendetta against the defendant. He asked if I was jealous of his relationship with my sister. He tried to paint me as the bitter spinster who wanted to destroy a happy marriage. I leaned into the microphone and delivered the truth. I told him that I did not care about his client enough to hate him. I told him that math does not have feelings. Numbers do not hold grudges. They do not lie. And the numbers prove that his client was a thief. The lawyer stuttered, looking at the sea of red figures on the screen. He had no rebuttal for the bank statements. He had no explanation for the IP addresses. He sat down defeated. The closing arguments were a formality. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman stood up. He did not look at Brad. He looked at the judge. The word guilty rang out like a bell. Guilty on wire fraud. Guilty on money laundering. Guilty on aggravated identity theft. 30 counts. 30 strikes. Brad slumped in his chair, putting his head in his hands, realizing that his charm had finally run out. The Honorable Judge Patterson adjusted his glasses and looked down at the defendant with pure disdain. He described Brad's actions as predatory, vile, and devoid of humanity. He said that society needed to be protected from men who view their own family as prey. He raised the wooden gavel high. It hung in the air for a split second, a suspended moment of finality. Then it came down. The sharp crack echoed off the mahogany walls like a gunshot ending the war. I gathered my files, clicked my laser pointer off, and stepped down from the witness stand. I did not smile. I did not celebrate. I simply walked out of the double doors, leaving the wreckage behind me. The ledger was finely balanced. Judge Patterson was a man who believed in consequences, and he delivered them with the weight of an anvil. The courtroom was silent as he read the sentence for Bradley Jenkins. 144 months in a federal penitentiary, 12 years. There is no parole in the federal system, which meant Brad would serve 85% of that time behind bars. He would be nearly 50 years old when he saw freedom again. I watched Brad as the number was read. He did not cry this time. He just stared at the table, his face a blank mask of shock. The reality of a decade in a cage had finally shut down his nervous system. The bailiffs moved in immediately, pulling him to his feet and shackling his hands to his waist. He was led out through the side door without a backward glance at the wife he had ruined or the in-laws he had bankrupt. He was just a number now. Then came my sister. Tisha stood trembling before the bench. Her lawyer had pleaded ignorance, portraying her as a naive spouse manipulated by a master criminal. The judge bought it partially. He sentenced her to 3 years of supervised probation and 500 hours of community service. She avoided prison, but she did not look relieved. She looked furious. She felt she was the victim of a miscarriage of justice, not realizing that in any other courtroom she would have been an accessory to wire fraud. She signed her paperwork with an aggressive scratch of the pen, her eyes burning holes into the back of my head. She was free to go, but she had nowhere to go. Her assets were frozen. Her car was seized. Her credit was destroyed. Finally, the judge turned his attention to Otis and Verna Sterling. Because of their advanced age and the clear evidence that they had been psychologically manipulated by Brad, the prosecution had declined to pursue custodial sentences. They were spared prison, but the court showed no mercy regarding the money. The judge ordered full restitution. The judgment was absolute. The house on Elm Street, the home they had lived in for 30 years, was formally forfeited to the bank to cover the fraudulent equity line. Their retirement accounts, which were already drained, were frozen to pay back the SBA loans. They were walking out of that courtroom as free citizens, but they were leaving as paupers. They had zero assets, no home, no savings, no pension. They were 70 years old, and they were starting over from absolute zero. I gathered my briefcase and stood up. The bailiff opened the gate, and I walked into the aisle. My parents were huddled together near the exit with Tisha clinging to them. It was a tableau of misery. When I approached, they stiffened. I stopped for a moment, expecting perhaps a flicker of recognition that I had saved them from dying in prison. I expected them to realize that my intervention was the only reason they weren't wearing orange jumpsuits right now. I was wrong. My father Otis looked at me with eyes that were cold and dead. He spat the words out in a harsh whisper. He called me a traitor. He said I had destroyed the family to satisfy my own ego. My mother Verna turned her face away, refusing to even acknowledge my existence. Tisha hissed at me, telling me to rot in hell. They stood there united in their delusion. In their minds, I was the architect of their downfall, not the whistleblower who put out the fire. They preferred the lie that Brad was a genius and I was a saboteur because that lie allowed them to keep their pride. The truth that they were greedy and foolish was too painful to bear, so they projected that pain onto me. I looked at them one last time. I saw 3 people who were drowning and angry at the person who had thrown them a life vest because it hit them in the head. I felt a strange lightness in my chest. The guilt I had carried for years, the need to please them, the desperate desire for their validation, it all evaporated in that cold hallway. I realized I could not save people who wanted to be victims. I nodded once, a final silent goodbye to the strangers who shared my last name. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the courthouse and stepped out onto the wide stone steps. The afternoon sun hit my face with a brilliant, warming intensity. The air smelled of rain and city traffic, but to me it smelled like oxygen. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs completely. The noise of the city surrounded me, a chaotic, beautiful symphony of life, moving forward. I adjusted my bag on my shoulder and walked down the steps. I was alone. I had no parents to call. I had no sister to visit. I had no family dinners to attend. And for the first time in my entire life, I felt completely and utterly free. The ledger was closed. The balance was zero. And the future was entirely mine. It had been 3 days since the gavel fell. 3 days of silence. 3 days of waking up without checking my bank accounts for unauthorized withdrawals. I was sitting in my living room, the one I had fought so hard to protect, watching the rain streak against the glass. The house was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise that had filled my life for the past year. My phone sat on the coffee table screen, dark. I knew the call was coming. I had calculated the burn rate of the petty cash they had left in their pockets. A motel room, fast food, a few bottles of cheap liquor to numb the pain. The math said they would run out of resources by Tuesday evening. It was Tuesday 7:00 p.m. The phone vibrated against the wood, a harsh buzzing insect intruding on my peace. I looked down. The caller ID flashed a single word, Mom. I stared at it for a long moment. A year ago, that name would have triggered a reflex of anxiety and a need to fix whatever was broken. I would have answered on the first ring, checkbook in hand, ready to play the savior. Now I just felt a dull, distant curiosity. I picked up the device and slid my thumb across the screen. I did not say hello. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited. For the first 10 seconds, there was only the sound of ragged breathing and the background noise of a television blaring a game show. Then my mother's voice crackled through the speaker. She sounded small, broken and wet, as if she had been crying for hours. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize for the scene at the courthouse. She didn't ask if I was okay after being publicly disowned by my own father. She went straight to the need. She told me they were at a budget motel off the interstate. She said the room smelled like smoke and the sheets were stained. She said Dad was refusing to eat. She said Tisha was useless and was staying with a friend who wouldn't take the parents in. Then came the pivot. The tone shifted from pathetic to demanding. She told me they needed $2,000. Just for a deposit on a small apartment, she said. Just to get them on their feet until Dad's Social Security check cleared. She spoke as if it were a loan, as if they had ever paid me back for anything in their lives. She used the word family 3 times in 2 sentences. She said that no matter what happened, family helps family. She said that I was the only one with stability, implying that my stability was a resource they were entitled to harvest. She was trying to tap a vein that had already collapsed. I listened until she paused for breath. I could hear the expectation in the silence. She was waiting for me to sigh, to lecture her briefly, and then to ask for the routing number. She was waiting for the old Jasmine, but that Jasmine had died in the bank lobby the day my father slapped her. I leaned back into my sofa and spoke clearly. I reminded her of the last conversation we had before the raid. I reminded her of the words she had screamed at me when I tried to show her the evidence. She had called me jealous. She had called me bitter. But most importantly, she had called me selfish. She had told me that I only cared about myself and my money. I let that hang in the air for a moment. My mother stammered, trying to backtrack. She said she didn't mean it, that she was under stress. I cut her off. I told her that she was right. I told her that for 30 years I had tried to be generous, and it had earned me nothing but contempt. So I was going to give her exactly what she claimed I was. I was going to be selfish. I was going to keep my money. I was going to keep my peace. I was going to keep my life. I told her that the selfish daughter she created was no longer interested in funding their destruction. I heard her gasp on the other end. The realization hit her that the ATM was permanently out of order. She started to scream, her voice rising in that familiar shrill pitch that used to terrify me. She started to curse, invoking God and duty. I didn't let her finish. I told her simply to never call this number again. I pulled the phone away from my ear, her tiny, tinny voice still shouting impotent threats into the void. I pressed the red icon to end the call. The silence rushed back into the room, heavy and sweet. I didn't stop there. I opened the contact settings. I scrolled down to the bottom of the screen. Block caller, confirm. I did the same for my father. I did the same for Tisha. One by one, I severed the digital tethers that bound me to their toxicity. It wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of hygiene. I placed the phone back on the table. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to make dinner for one. I had never felt less lonely in my life. The story was over. The sequel was mine alone to write. The house was empty now. The forensic team had peeled away the yellow tape weeks ago, and I had hired a crew to strip the interior down to the studs. The smell of stale champagne, cheap cologne, and the acrid chemical sting of methamphetamine was finally gone, replaced by the scent of sawdust and fresh white paint. I walked through the rooms one last time, my heels clicking on the newly installed hardwood floors. I stopped in the dining room, where Brad had once stacked my money like a prop. I paused in the master bedroom, where Tisha had recorded her delusions of grandeur. I stood over the spot in the closet where the floor had been torn up to hide the poison. It was all seamless now, perfect, sterile. It looked like a model home in a magazine, a blank canvas waiting for a family that wasn't broken. But to me, it would never be a home. It was a mausoleum of betrayal. I didn't want the rental income anymore. I didn't want the asset. I wanted the purge. I listed the property on a Monday morning. By Wednesday, we had a bidding war. The market was hungry, and no one knew the history of what had happened between these walls. I accepted an all-cash offer from a young couple moving down from New York. They saw a beautiful investment. I saw a crime scene being washed away. When we sat at the closing table, the title agent slid a check across the mahogany surface. It was for the net proceeds of the sale, a staggering sum that represented years of my hard work and the equity I had fought a literal war to protect. I looked at the number. It was enough to buy a luxury car. It was enough to travel the world for a year. It was enough to do anything I wanted. But as I held the paper, I felt a strange heaviness. This money had been the catalyst for the destruction of my family. It was the magnet that had drawn out the worst in everyone I loved. I couldn't just put it in my bank account. It needed to be cleansed. It needed to be transmuted into something that couldn't be stolen, or smoked, or wasted. I drove straight from the closing attorney's office to the heart of the city, to a building I knew well. I took the elevator to the top floor and walked into the office of the University Foundation. The director, a woman named Mrs. Galloway, looked surprised to see me without an appointment, but she ushered me in. I sat down and placed the check on her desk. I told her I wanted to start an endowment. I told her I didn't want a building named after me. I didn't want a plaque on a bench. I had a very specific set of instructions. I established the Sterling Shield Scholarship. It was to be a full-ride grant awarded exclusively to young women of color from underrepresented communities who were pursuing degrees in forensic accounting or corporate law. I explained the criteria with a fierce intensity. I wanted to find the girls who were good at math but were told to be quiet. I wanted the girls who were detail-oriented but were overlooked. I wanted to arm them. I wanted to give them the weapons I had used to save myself the ability to read a balance sheet, the knowledge to dissect a contract, and the courage to follow the money. I wanted to create a generation of women who could spot a Brad Jenkins from a mile away and shut him down before he could ruin a single life. Mrs. Galloway looked at the check and then at me, her eyes wide. She asked if I was sure. She said this was a significant portion of wealth to give away. I looked her in the eye and smiled a genuine smile that reached all the way to my soul. I told her that I wasn't giving it away. I was investing it. I was investing in the truth. I told her that if this money could save just one woman from signing a document she didn't understand or stop one daughter from being manipulated by a predator, then it was the highest return on investment I could ever achieve. We signed the papers right there. I watched as the ink dried, sealing the pact. The money that had almost destroyed me was now going to build an army of protectors. I walked out of the building into the late afternoon sun. The air felt lighter. The phantom weight of my parents' expectations, my sister's jealousy, and my brother-in-law's malice had finally lifted. I had taken the ugliest chapter of my life and rewritten the ending. I had turned their greed into someone else's education. I checked my watch. I had a dinner reservation with Elena, the woman who had helped me take Brad down. We were going to toast to the future. I walked down the busy street, just another face in the crowd, but inside I felt invincible. I had lost a family, but I had found my legacy. And for the first time, the numbers finally added up to something beautiful. The golden hour in Napa Valley is not just a time of day, it is a physical sensation. The light that floods over the rolling hills of the vineyard is thick and amber, warming the skin and turning the endless rows of grapevines into ribbons of gold. I sat on the terrace of a private villa, the kind of place that Brad would have rented for a photo shoot, but never actually paid for. The difference was that the deed to this weekend rental was in my name, and the credit card used to book it had a zero balance. The air smelled of crushed earth and ripening fruit, a sharp contrast to the antiseptic sting of the federal courthouse that had been my reality for the last year. I held a glass of Cabernet Sauvignon in my hand, watching the crimson liquid swirl against the crystal. It was a vintage from 2018, complex and bold. It tasted like patience. It tasted like victory. I looked out at the vineyard below, where the workers were moving through the rows. They were pruning the vines, cutting away the dead wood and the wild overgrowth. It is a violent process to the untrained eye. They slice through thick branches, letting them fall to the dirt to rot. But a vintner knows the truth. You cannot have a harvest if you refuse to cut back the waste. If you let the vine keep every branch it tries to grow, it will choke itself. It will expend all its energy trying to sustain dead weight, and it will never produce a single piece of fruit worth tasting. I realized then that nature has no concept of guilt. Nature understands that survival requires subtraction. For 30 years, I had tried to be the root system for a family that only wanted to be the parasite. I had fed them my energy, my money, and my loyalty. I had let them wrap themselves around me until I could barely breathe, thinking that their suffocating grip was a hug. I thought that because we shared DNA, I owed them my life. I thought that being a good daughter meant setting myself on fire to keep them warm. But looking at the severed branches on the ground, I finally understood the math of human relationships. A liability does not become an asset just because you love it. A debt does not vanish just because you ignore it. And a family member who demands you destroy yourself for their comfort is not family. They are an infection. I thought about them one last time, not with anger, but with the distant clinical detachment of an auditor reviewing a closed file. Brad was sitting in a 6 by 8 cell wearing a uniform that belonged to the state, counting the days until he was an old man. Tisha was likely sitting in a cramped apartment scrolling through her old photos, trying to convince herself she was still a queen in exile. My parents were waking up in a motel room wondering why the world had been so unfair to them, never realizing they had held the keys to their own prison and threw them away. They were all serving sentences of their own making. I had tried to be their lawyer, their banker, and their savior. But in the end, the only role they allowed me to play was the villain. So I accepted the casting. I became the villain in their story, so I could be the hero in mine. I stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony, leaning against the warm stone railing. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the sweet, clean air of freedom. There was no phone buzzing with demands. There was no fear of a knock at the door. There was only the silence of a life that had been balanced. People always say that blood is thicker than water. They use it as a weapon to keep you in line, to keep you suffering in silence. But they forget that blood can also become toxic. When a limb goes gangrenous, you do not keep it because it is part of you. You cut it off. You sever the connection to save the body. It leaves a scar and it hurts like hell, but it is the only way to survive. I raised my glass toward the dying sun, a solitary toast to the woman I used to be and the woman I had become. I had lost a father, a mother, a sister, and a brother-in-law. By societal standards, I was an orphan. I was alone. But as I looked at the vast open horizon, I felt a profound sense of wholeness. I had stripped away the fraud, the lies, and the emotional manipulation. I had audited my life and liquidated the bad assets. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I had lost a toxic family, but I had found myself. And looking at the peace that surrounded me, I knew the truth. That was the single most profitable investment of my entire life. I drained the glass and set it down on the stone table. The sun vanished completely, leaving the world in a velvet darkness. I smiled into the night. The ledger was closed. Jasmine's journey teaches us a brutal but necessary truth. Financial boundaries are the highest form of self-respect. We often confuse enabling with loyalty, believing that family comes first, even when they are actively destroying us. But as this story illustrates, you cannot save people who are committed to drowning, and you are never obligated to set yourself on fire just to keep others warm. True freedom begins the moment you stop seeking validation from those who only value you as a resource. Cutting out toxic family isn't cruelty. It is an act of survival, and the most profitable investment you will ever make. Subscribe now for more powerful stories about justice, money, and reclaiming your life.